I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by Young Harris College, the Richard B. Russell Library, and the University of Georgia. Our guest is George T. Smith, the only Georgian in modern political history to be elected Speaker of the House, Lieutenant Governor, Judge of the Georgia Court of Appeals, and a Supreme Court Justice. What shall I call you, Mr. Speaker, Governor, or Judge Smith?
George T.
George T. You know, before we get too far, let's explain George T. and George L. You probably would not have used your middle initial, would you, if there hadn't been a George L?
No.
And both of you were speakers.
Yeah. He was speaker and I was speaker, and he was speaker and I was lieutenant governor, and they never got us straight. The news media never did get us straight.
Well,
it helped us, because whenever they printed something that bad about me, I told him that was George L. they was talking about. And whenever it started on George L., he said that was George T. he talking about.
Well, it all began for you in Mitchell County.
Yep. No. Cobb. Grady County. I was born.
Grady.
Oh yeah, I was born and raised in Mitchell. Sure.
Right, Mitchell County. You were born there, and what was it like growing up back then in Mitchell County?
Well, I was born in October 15, 1916. Of course, I was about 6 years old before I really remember anything, because I started school when I was 6 years old. And it was all farmers, no automobiles, no trucks, all wagons, buggies, and riding mules and horses. I don't remember an automobile. There were scattered automobiles, but I don't remember an automobile until 1924. I was 8 years old. There were scattered automobiles. But I didn't get to go to town, so I didn't see any of them. I was born at my grandmother's house. My mother was a baby girl, and I was born at the community of Greenwood. Hopeful. I was born at Hopeful, at my grandmother's home, and came back to the old log cabin house that my grandfather built when he came back from the war between the states. By the way, he went to the war between the states. He's the first battle of Manassas, and he was at Appomattox. Went through the entire war, didn't get a crippling injury. It's amazing. I followed him several years later, and I was just glad I got through without a crippling injury. But I was born and raised there, and we went back to that little small farm, 125 acres. And I lived there for a couple of years, and then Daddy moved to Flint to be an overseer. Then he came back home to the home farm, and he came back because cotton was just coming in big, and he was making so much money, he decided he'd come back home and start back farming again with cotton, because there's so much more money than what he was. He came back in 1920 or 21, I don't remember which year, but it was the first year that the boll weevil invaded the South. He had 48 acres of cotton and made one bale. Lost all of it to boll weevils. Well, he tried it again next year and made another bale off 40 acres. And ultimately lost his place as a result of it, because the money he borrowed to farm on those 2 years, he paid interest on it until he lost his place in 1935. Interest is the only thing in the world that's higher than it is now. Interest was 8%. And he lost his place because he couldn't pay 8% interest on $3,000. Listen, you don't know what a hard time is if you didn't go through the 1929s and till the war started. You don't know anything about it. Hogs, 2.5 cents a pound. Cotton, 3 to 5 cents a pound. Peanuts, 20 to $22 a ton. Corn was about, I think it's 24 cents a bushel. And you don't know what hard times were. The difference is this. We never had known any better, so we didn't know any better. That's exactly the difference. What it is now, good lad, we'd have a revolution now if things was as cheap as they were back then. I didn't go to town but 2 times a year. That was when they bought the first load of ground in the spring and the first bale of cotton in the fall. Daddy gave me a nickel every time I went. And a nickel bought more than you might think. It's just used for change now, but back then you could buy something for a nickel. I stayed that place, went to school, started school when I was 6 years old. Walked 3 miles each way every day. And I went to Pine Cliff. The reason I went to Pine Cliff because the young lady that was teaching at Pine Cliff, her name was Ella McCoy, and she was from Tennessee. She had a record of being a very fine teacher, and she was. She was absolutely a gem of a teacher. Daddy had something about not wanting to start school until he was 6 years old. I was 6 years old in October, but I didn't start school until January the 1st. Well, when I started January the 1st, Miss Elma had 4 classes. And there's a 1-room schoolhouse split in 2, so we have 2 rooms. And the other teacher had from 5, 6, and 7. Miss McCoy had the first 4. So I had 7 months school. My class was the last one in the day, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. School opened at 8, by the way. I walked 3 miles. You can imagine what time I left home walking 3 miles in December. School every day. Whenever she started with me, she took me to the last class at 4 o'clock. And she took me in her lap. So she taught me the first half of my school time sitting in her lap. So I passed the first grade the first year. Went there till I finished the 4th grade, and went through the 5th. And when I got through the 5th with the teacher, the other teacher, 5th grade, by the way, she married a cousin of my daddy. She was horrible. So he switched me to Greenwood. It was about the same distance. I walked to Greenwood. Miss Helen, I can't think of her last name. Helen, anyway, she taught me down there. She's a good teacher, but she couldn't touch Miss Helen McCoy. She was one of the best I ever had. Went there 1 year, and then they put on a bus route to Hopeful. I lived about about 5 miles from Hopeful. So they put a bus route on, and I started riding the bus. That was a new venture. I went to school to Christmas in 7th grade, and Daddy took me out and put me to work at a Christmas of the 8th grade. I'd finished the 7th grade. I finished the 7th grade, had all A's. Went to Christmas in the 8th grade and had all D's. So my father said, "Son, you tired of going to school?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Well, all right then." Said, Monday morning, said, "You get you up, Rowdy and Roddy, and start breaking that land back on next to the Pollocks." Well, it took me about 2 weeks to really realize what I had done. I'd made a terrible error. 5 years later, I started back in the 8th grade at 18 years old. I had learned to appreciate it. Whenever I first got to be Speaker of the House and I'd be talking to school people, particularly they'd want to make a point, they'd say, "This is a young man who went to school and dropped out of school, and he realized that education was so good that he went back in school to get education." I always corrected that. That wasn't the reason. You plow a mule in South Georgia 5 years, and doggone if you won't do anything to get back, classroom or wherever it takes. So I started school at Hopeful at Christmas when I was 18 years old. I finished school at Hopeful when I was 21. Went to Middle Georgia when I was 22 for 1 quarter. And going to Middle Georgia was a misguided place. Middle Georgia was a junior college society school. I was out of my class, literally and figuratively. So at Christmas, I switched to Abraham Baldwin. The main reason I switched to Abraham Baldwin, I'd run out of money. It didn't take me 1 year. Tuition was only $69 a half. You had to buy your books, but tuition, food, and board was only $69 a half. So I went to ABAC, we call it Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College at Tifton. It was strictly a rural school. Most of the folks that were working their way through. And I went there because I could work my way through. I know the last year, I didn't spend but $6. I worked my way totally through the last year because during the summer between my first and last year's college, I worked in the tobacco there, and they paid me to work in the tobacco during summertime. And then I did the rest of it after that. One reason I got to work so like that, I was elected president student body day back. The way I did that, I guess that's the first time I was elected president class at a high school. But I reckon the reason I did that was because I wanted to keep working, and because that's the only way I could get through. And I tried to figure out the best way I could get elected president of the student body. Didn't tell anybody. And I came up with the idea if I would learn everybody's name on that campus one way or the other, it would help. I could call everybody by one name, may have been a nickname or something, whenever I ran for it, and I won. And there's no doubt in my mind that's what did it. I was able to recognize those people and speak to them. So the last year I spent $6. I worked for the tobacco and I got 10 cents an hour. That's unbelievable, but it's 10 cents an hour. And when the tobacco season got up to the point you would pull the tobacco and cure it, I come to find out see, when we used to cure tobacco at home, you had to use logs and a furnace. When I got over there, they had a thermostatic controlled gas system for the tobacco barn. That was heaven, you know. So I just moved me a cot down there, set the thermostat whatever I wanted, get up every 30 minutes. And I just worked it all the way around. I charged 23 hours a day. And the second school year, when it started the first week, I got a message from the president. He would like to see me in his office. I could imagine what in the world the president wanted to see me about. I said, Mr. President King. He was about 6'2" or 3", bald-headed as a cue ball. They called him cue ball, but not to his face. I walked in and sat down. He said, Thornwell. The T, George T, that's Thornwell. I've never been called that after I got out of ABAC. I said, yes, sir. He said, I was just perusing your record for work this summer. And I noticed that you charge 23 hours a day. Would you care to explain that? I said, yes, sir. And I explained it to him. I said, I wasn't getting 10 cents an hour, and I needed all that I could get, and I figured out where I could use that thermostat, and I did it for 10 hours, for 23 hours a day. I took an hour out to go to lunch and supper. And I was just right out, maybe a quarter of a mile where he went to eat. He folded up the papers. He says, well, that was a novel idea, wasn't it? And shut the papers, but they made a rule right then you couldn't work more than 12 hours and then get paid for it. Well, that's the way I did it. I got out of that lay back and got in the Navy. When I got in the Navy, I realized that I was going to get in the Army or the Navy or something, because they said they were going to start conscripting everybody October the 15th that year. So I decided I would go get in the Navy, because my granddad had told my daddy about all the times he had to sleep when it was cold, and he'd wake up in the morning with icicles 12 and 15 inches long up around, and we'd sleep all night. Clothes would freeze on him in 50 yards after they'd waded a creek or something during the war. So I got me a place. I said, I may not have it but one night, but at least I'll sleep dry until I get wet for good. So I went up there and took the exam at Albany. When I got through, the guy that was giving the exam for the Navy, he had a lot of stripes on him. I don't remember what it was. And he said, he said, why didn't you, he said, I see you got a 2-year college degree. I said, yes. He said, well, why didn't you make application to go to the V7 program? I said, I don't know what a V7 program is. He said, well, if you get in the Navy, you got 2 years college, you can make application for an officer in the Navy. You can get in the V7 program. They send you to the State Pier in New York. You get on a ship, you go to sea for a month, and after you get back, if they recommend you can go to Northwestern University and get an officer's degree in the Navy. I said, give it to me then. So I got that and went up and Macon and passed it. I went up to Macon and got the final passage, and all the funny thing happened there. I tried to get in the Air Force before I did, and the rest of it came to Atlanta. Stayed up here 2 days, one of them all day and all night in the bed. I passed everything but the blood pressure. My blood pressure was around 110 or 15 to about 170 or 80. Yeah, I was 21 years old. And that was unbelievable. So they wouldn't take me. They tried to, because if somebody said they'd take anybody in the Army and Air Corps that day if you could look through one ear and see a light out of the other one, because they were looking for him. That was the best thing that ever happened to me, though, because if I'd have got on the airplanes back in that day, at that time, was just a bunch of ramshackle things. So I went to New York, never been north of Albany but one time, and got to New York, and I was scared to death. You can imagine a farm boy from South Georgia, never been any further north than Albany but one time in New York City. So I got there, and I was, about getting your tonsils blistered with sun. I was typical, I'd fit that. But I got on this ship, the old USS Quincy. It was sunk at the Battle of Savo Island. I spent the month on it, and they took me into the Navy. I made it. A story that needs telling happened there. When I took I had only two years. I didn't have a single year of advanced math. I had a little country school, hopeful one with 400 people in there. I had good grades in it. Had all A's in everything I did, but I didn't have anything past half a term of geometry. So I went up there, and the crowd, mine a floor. I was in the 7th Division, we called it. And it was tough. Navigation was what was really tough. I memorized navigation. I didn't have a background, a basis of arithmetic, math to really ever grasp it. So I memorized it. So we had our final test, and they gave us what they call a day's work. You start at 3 o'clock in the morning and go all the way for 24 hours. Well, I set out on my day's work, and by the time I got noon the next day, I was off the paper. They just gave you the paper that's supposed to fit them. Well, by the time I got through traveling till noon that day, from 3 to noon, I was off the paper. Well, make a long story short, I got off the paper every time I returned. I said, well, nothing like going back to the farm, so it wasn't quite that much. I was devastated. Got on the elevator, went down the elevator, was stuffed with the members of the class, and it was like a tomb. I noticed, I said, my God, this is like a tomb. Everybody's just hangdog look. So one fellow finally got courage enough to say something. He said, how many of you didn't get past noon? None of us did. They had given us an advanced problem in navigation that they had not taught us about. We all flunked it. And so they just gave everybody 2.5 and let us go. Boy, I tell you, nice to have ignorant folks with you sometimes. I went on and got in the Navy and got on the USS Quincy for a month. Got back, then I was put on the naval submarine supply ship. We supplied the subs. And we had a lot of them, but they wasn't any good. And I stayed on that from June when I got out of school to February. Then they transferred me to Norfolk to go to a midshipman school, to go to naval. I was an officer in charge of a naval gun crew on a supply ship. All these supply ships, we was taking stuff to Murmansk, and they were sinking them off the coast out there, just like, well, they were just sinking them day and night. So I went there, and we went to Battle Creek, Virginia. Went through training there for. Had the crowd with me that I was going to use as my group. It was 11 of us, 9 of us, 10 with me. We got on the SS Yaka. It was a civilian ship, Mushy Marina, but it was run by Mushy Marinas. The only part that we did, we took care of the guns, and shot the guns and handled the guns if we was attacked. And it's too long to go into detail there, but I learned what labor unions were. Don't get me on that one, because I tell you it was, anyway. So I was the first American convoy that went to Murmansk, and we had quite a time. We were shot at, torpedoed at, bombed, and there was sunk on one ship going over. But coming back, and the reason we just only one going over was because we got into a fog bank 3 days out of Murmansk, and the fog didn't lift. And the Germans never could get to us because of the airplanes, they couldn't find us. Went on into Murmansk. I was bombed 3 times when I was in Cola River. And they finally sunk my ship. And but it was in the river, so when it settled on the mud flats, they went there and pumped it out, put it in a dry dock, and repaired it because we were sunk by a bomb that did not explode. And the reason it didn't explode, I was on an old 1919 Liberty ship, which was had what they call a fiddly in it. That was when they used coal. It was nothing but coal. And there's a place about that wide, all the way from the floor plates at the bottom of the ship out the top, right in front of the boilers. And that was for a place to let the heat out from the use of coal. It gets so hot down there, that's the only way it could come out. And that bomb, it was coming down, like bombs would come down, they'd be straight up and moving like that. That bomb was moving like that, and it hit the side of my ship. It never did get to the water. It hit the side of it, and it knocked a hole out of it you could drive a freight train through. And went all the way out the bottom before it exploded. And it hit right where that fiddler was. And going sideways like that, the point didn't hit anything. So you had to hit the point of it to set the bomb off. It hit nothing. So it went all the way through and went out the bottom of the ship. That's when it contacted. And when it contacted, it blew up, blew a hole in the bottom of the ship. So we had holes all over the place. And they pumped it up and came back to America. I was standing as close near that door to where the bomb went through the side of the ship. All I had to do was look over the side, and there it was. We was bombed a couple of more times before we left there. We was dried up 3 times from bombs. One time we was sunk. And we finally got back. On the way back, at 9 o'clock on the 5th of July, 1942, we lost 7 ships in 15 minutes. They always told us that we'd run into a German wolf pack. And that's what I believed until I got out of the Navy and years later read a book. Wait a minute, we didn't run into a German wolf pack. The stupid pilot had led us into our own minefield. We sunk 7 of our own ships. And I'll never forget that one because the crowd that I went through midshipman school, armed guard school with, the 2 officers that I knew, we was on a line of 18 ships, 9 on each side, 2, 2, 2. One of my friends was number 1, I was number 2, and the other one was number 3. His ship was sunk. I missed the mines, and I don't know why, but I did. Mine was not sunk, but the one right behind me was sunk, and the one on my left, the bow was blown off. So I was sitting there, just Providence picked me out to live another day. And I don't never know what happened to those boys. I got back to America, and my ship, by being bombed and the dry docks along, I missed a lot of I missed all the convoys that went to places where they were sending convoys. The one I really missed was North Africa. Went to North Africa and Sicily and Italy. I didn't make that trip. Thank the Lord for that, because that crowd, they were gone a year and had a terrible time. And there wasn't a real convoy for me to pick up on, but they had an Army transport that was going to go to Hawaii. So they put me on that Army transport to Hawaii. And we went all the way down to the Panama Canal, came up to San Diego, and then went on out to Hawaii. I stayed on that ship for 7 months, going in an island. I've been there one of the islands of Hawaii and didn't have to pay a thing, but it was 7 months of my time. And it was quite a place. We never did have any problems out there. We get talking about it and all like that. I saw what the Japanese did to us because they never had cleaned it up much, just to get in and out. And I stayed there for a while. I spent 2 years in the Navy, and then I put on the Naval Land Force Equipment Depot in Albany, Alabama, Albany, California. And that's where all the equipment that was an invasion force in the South went through us. We dispensed it. They ordered it from us and picked it up from us in the San Francisco Bay on the Albany side. And I stayed there for 2 years. When I went there, they took me off the ship that I was on and transferred me to the port director's office with the directions that and with the directions that whenever the ship I just got off of was decommissioned from a commercial ship to a Navy ship, that I was to go back on it as gunnery officer. 2 years later, I went back on it. What happened was they lost me. They lost my orders somewhere or another. I had 3 sets of orders sent to me. They sent them all back, lost. And I reckon they would never have found me. But one of the fellows, the ship he had been sent to at the same time I was sent somewhere, was sunk. Everybody was lost. So his people were notified that he was unaccounted for. Ship and everything, he was sunk. And he went up there and he said, I ain't dead, I'm very much alive. Well, they found out that all our orders was in the corner of a warehouse over in San Francisco. Well, they soon got disgorged us and sent us to the South Pacific. But before we could get to the South Pacific, they dropped the atom bomb. Saved us, as far as I was concerned, because I had orders to the USS Harrison, which was a troop ship, and I was supposed to report to some of the islands right there close to Hawaii. I mean, to Japan. I don't know where it was, but I'd have been. We were supposed to invade them on November 11th, 1945, but it never did come around because they surrendered before that was over with. So I came back home, went to the University of Georgia. I was 29 years old. Went to law school. They let me in because they let a lot of them in. There was 125, 126 in my class. We didn't have enough seats for them. If you didn't get there early, you sat in the window. And we went through law school like that. We took a full course in law school in 8 quarters. That's when you're going a quarter. And if you go straight through 8 quarters, you get a law degree. I had only 2 hours, and 2 years. I had 125 units, but 84 of them count toward law school, and he took 92. So I was 8 short. And the registrar at that university, he pulled a lot of strings, and he gave me 8 points for being on a ship and shooting a star shot. And gave me trigonometry, I believe it was. I had a minor in trigonometry. I mean, I had a minor in mathematics, and he'd go but 4 years down 1 year at Hopeful High School. That's how hard they wanted them. Went through law school there, and then went to Cairo, Georgia. Mr. Sam Kane had a son, he was killed, and I went law practice with him. And I went to practice in January the 1st, 1948, making $60 a week. And I bought a house and a new car on $60 a week. I'd like to see you do that now. You can't go to a football game for $60, much less. But anyway, I stayed out went to practice law with Mr. King in Cairo, 1948, January 1st, 48. Well, while I was there, I was elected city attorney, county attorney, solicitor of state court, represented the EMC, and also was school board attorney. That's a lot of work and mighty poor pay. Got $50 a month for being county attorney. Can you beat that? $50 a month being city attorney. And when I went there, Mr. King took me because he said I wasn't interested in politics, and I wasn't. I really wasn't. I was just wanting to get out and get me a job, and I wanted one in South Georgia. I asked for it, South Georgia. I said I want a rural county in South Georgia. They said that'd be no problem. Everybody wants to go to Atlanta. One story I want to tell you that it pays you to do right because you don't know who's looking at you. When I got back and was finished up at law school at university, I went over to, all I was took a day out and went to Atlanta looking for jobs. So I thought, well, I'm going to start off with Hartford Insurance Company for a job for an appraisal, automobiles. And I went up to that place, and they took me, and I went in, and I sat down in the room to be interviewed by the fellow. And the room was about a big square from here, that door there. That was about as big as the office was in. And you could sit down, and it had wood up to just about your eyes. The rest of it was glass. And I sat down, and he sat down, and I noticed he kept looking, and he didn't do anything. And I wondered when he was going to start something. And in a minute, he got up and said, "Excuse me." And I watched him, and he went about 40 minutes to that wall over on to another cubicle and went in and stood up. He never did sit down. And they talked some little bit. We came back. He sat down and he said, "Well, you got the job." I said, "Got the job? You interviewed me." He said, "You see that fellow I went to talk to?" I said, "Yes." He said, "He tells me that you were a security officer at the Naval Land Force Equipment Depot. That's the same as chief of police at over 3,500 people. And a bunch of wild sailors, that wasn't easy. And he was in the fire department. He said the fire department was under your jurisdiction." I said, "That's right." And he told me that he had worked under me and knew me well and to hire me. You don't know who's looking at you, boys. Now, we'd switched places. I was his boss over there. He was the vice president of the insurance company there, and I'd have been my boss there. I went to practice law rather than other. But it really pays you. You don't know who's looking at you. And that old saying about be nice on the way up because you know who you be coming back down. That's really a test of it. So we had Cairo, Grady County had a terrible record for representatives getting in politics. And they had a fellow that got in politics and he weighed about 300 pounds, was elected. And he went two terms, 4 years as House representative. And the people that know politics and all that, they kept sending word back to the people in Cairo, says, "Y'all better get you somebody else up here." He said, "This man sleeps all the time. You know what's going on." He said, get somebody up here. So they came to see me. This is the closest I ever got to being conscripted to go somewhere. And they came to me and I said, I can't get in politics. They said, "Why?" I said, "I promised Mr. Sam King I'd stay out. And he gave me a job, I'm gonna live up to it." So what they did then, they got a committee of 3 and went to see Mr. Kane. I knew nothing about it. And he said, "Yeah, okay, he can go. It's all right with me for him to go." So I went to see him before I ever gave him that answer. He said, "No, it's all right if you go. Might do you good." So that's how I got in politics. I ran, the editor of the paper ran, and then the incumbent ran, then I ran. And I got more votes than both of them put together. So I was in politics. Well, that was 1958. My first term in legislature was 1959. Evander had just been elected, and Frank Twitty was floor leader. George L. Smith was the speaker, and Evander was the governor. And I was born and raised in Michigan County. Frank Twitty had known my folks. We didn't know them. They voted for him, supported him always. And you're talking about some committee appointments. I got committee appointments that people lived and died in that place and never did get. I was on the Judicial Committee, University of Georgia Committee, and the Governor's Committee called State or Republic Committee. Those three. You stay on a lifetime, never get on one of them. Well, I stayed that way for 2 years. And at the end of 2 years, Frank came to me and said, "You going to be on the Appropriation Committee?" I said, "Yes." So he took me off the University Committee and put me on the Appropriation Committee. Can you imagine being that 2 years on the Appropriation Committee? It's ain't what you know is who you know, friend. Don't ever forget that. And I went over there, and they made me vice chairman of it. And in 1 year, I was chairman of the Appropriation Committee for the House of Representatives in 3 years. That's what you saw, what a break is. Carl Sanders ran then, and when Carl ran, he started off lieutenant governor, and I told him I'd help him. And then when he moved over against Marvin Griffith, see, Marvin's from Bainbridge, and I was from Cairo, they're 24 miles apart. And I was supporting Carl because he and I were classmates. Well, I thought he could do it too. And people got so mad at me in my county, they'd walk across the street, he was speaking to me. They just didn't like me because I wouldn't support old Marv. Well, Carl won. Whenever Carl won, everybody got a good humor with me, quick. That's when I found out how fast people could quit hating you. And by the way, Marvin didn't beat Carl by 264 votes in my county. I really went to bat for him. But then Carl was elected in '62. And then I would leave Cairo Thursday night after work, drive to Atlanta, and work with Carl until Monday night. I'd go all over the state over the weekend and do speeches for him and telephone, and I really worked with him. And so whenever he won, I know the afternoon he finally said that he won. It was on Wednesday afternoon. We was all sitting around there in the big lobby of the headquarters. And all at once I really realized that I noticed that everybody was gone. And I was left alone. About that time, Bill Trotter, you remember Bill Trotter?
Oh, yeah.
Little short fella.
Yeah.
Bow-legged. He went with it. He AAA ball one time. Mm-hmm. Good player. He said, the governor wants to see you. And so I walked to the room where they were, and everybody was in there. They had silently gone in there, and Carl said, "Sit down, George T." George, I still wasn't George T. So I sat down, and he said, "How'd you like to be speaker?" I said, "I'd like it." Didn't take me no 2 days to figure it out. You know, they said, "I ain't worthy of it." The heck with that kind of crap. You don't get anywhere saying, I'm not worthy of it, I'll take it. I said, "Oh, yeah, I will do." He said, "All right, go get on the telephone." And what they had come to, they'd all sit down and talked it out. They said that I was the only man they thought that could become qualified to be Speaker. They didn't think I was qualified to be it, but what anybody's qualified, they trust because they all supported Marvin Griffin. That's how I got to be Speaker. And it was, we had a rough time the first year too. Boy, I tell you what, it was rugged. But we made it. And then I liked it so well, I decided I wanted to be a lieutenant governor. I didn't want to stay in politics all my life, but I wasn't ready to get out. And so I ran against
Peter Zach Gill.
Peter Zach Gill. Peter Zach was, no, I won't start what I say. Peter Zach was smart as whip, a great speaker, lazy as a foxhound in June. And just, he never did take it serious. He never did take me serious at all. The first time anybody ever asked him about it was on a street walking in Albany, and they asked him, said, what do you think about the speaker running for lieutenant governor against you? He said, well, I never did go bear hunting with a rabbit gun. And that just made me mad. It just burned me up, you know. I worked harder. It was easy to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning. Well, Zach didn't work any. He didn't work. He just figured it. He had the Tallengers behind him, and Vanderbilt was behind him, and Campbell was behind him, and he knew it, and he figured it. He's all right. I can't remember the chairman of the county commissioners from Clark County, but he ran. It was 3 hours, and he was the odd man out was the man. Also, fixed to tell something I've never told before, except on something like this.
Randall Bedgood.
Randall Bedgood, you're right. So when I was Speaker of the House, I said, I ain't gonna want to stay here always. I might want to get a lieutenant governor, and I can't be Peter Zach Gill, lieutenant governor, with a plurality. So the second year I was Speaker of the House, I very quietly got a bill passed that you could not be elected to an office unless you had 50% plus one. Well, that paid off. Because first, when I ran the 3 hours, Zach was number one with 49.2% of the votes. I had 44%. Well, we had a runoff. And in the runoff, I beat Zach 139,000 votes. It's the most amazing thing I ever. Peter Zach just would not. He wouldn't work. He just simply wouldn't work. He always was talking ugly about me, but he never would work. One of the biggest mistakes he made was they asked him back then if he was a Democrat. The Republicans were making noises. If he was a Democrat, you did in 1966, you had to sign a pledge to support the nominees, Democratic nominees. But you didn't have to swear to it. So he and I was speaking and gave it to the Junior Chamber of Commerce over at DeKalb County one night, and they asked him if he was going to support the nominees. He said, I don't know. They said, why don't you know? He said, I don't know who's going to be elected. They said, well, you signed an agreement, didn't you? He said, yeah, but I wasn't under oath. I was next up. He got off and left. He wasn't there and to defend himself, and that was a stupid thing to do. That's all he do. If he's the first one to speak, he'd go. He wouldn't stay around. I always stayed around it. They talk about you if you left, you know. You wouldn't need to be there to defend yourself. So he left, and I knew they was going to ask me about that question because I knew my name. And I went to racking my brain what kind of answer I'd give. And as I was walking up to the platform to answer it, to say what I must say and get questioned, it came to me, the answer did. So they asked me about that. He said, what do you think about that? I said, well, and they said, now the lieutenant governor said he wasn't under oath, so I wasn't there when he made this talk, so I said, wasn't under oath. What do you got to say? I said, I got only one thing to say. I don't believe the people of the state of Georgia will elect a man, lieutenant governor, that's got to be under oath before you can believe what he says. It killed him. I just had papers all over the state with little short editorials just reporting what he said and what I said. It just killed him. He was careless that way. He never planned anything. First thing up was out, and that plus another very involved thing, dealing with the House and the Senate with liquor, because he lost every newspaper in the state except Albany Herald when he pulled that bone about the liquor deal. He promised him he would not put a bill on the floor without giving them a chance to appear before the committee. He not only put it out of committee, he passed it, and they never did know about it. They read in the paper. He lost them all because he thought he was in so deep.
He was a county unit politician.
That's right. That's right.
Let's talk about that for a minute.
All right.
Going back to the Sanders-Griffin election, where everybody thought Marvin Griffin would win.
He would if it hadn't been for the county unit system being thrown out.
So they threw out the county unit system, and that just completely changed politics in Georgia forever. And
Marvin Griffin didn't know what to do with it. It was nothing to do with it. Now that was another reason I was so positive in helping Carl Sanders. Don't tell me how I knew this, but I knew this. We knew that the court was going to throw out the county unit system before the election. But time enough to know that we could run in that direction. So we just, Carl just hit the high spots. He worked on the cities and didn't fool with rural areas much. And that's what happened. It was a plurality. I mean, it was a majority vote thing rather than a county unit system, and Carl won.
And he won either way.
Yeah, he would have won either way, as it turned out, but we didn't know that.
Right, true.
But I changed it, got it changed way back there, so I could win. I didn't know it. And I needed it. I'd have lost. I'd have lost if it hadn't been for that. Zach must have felt real sick when you lost it by 0.8%. Well, I got out of the legislature and went. I was elected as lieutenant governor. I got beat for lieutenant governor, and I then started practicing law up here. And I was going back to Cairo. I had interest in the bank down there and all like that. And my secretary at that time said, "I thought you wanted to get on the appellate courts." I said, "I do." And she said, she sits right over there. She'd been working with me for 42 years. She said, "Well, how?" She said, "You go back down to Cairo." That's almost out of state. So you get down there, you're going to never get your name in the front where you can go to get on the courts. Now, if you leave it up here, you just forget about it. Well, I thought about it a little bit, and I agreed with her. So I went to work with what was that guy's name? It'll come to me in a minute.
Here in Marietta?
Yeah, in Marietta. He was a very prominent lawyer in Marietta.
Harold
Willingham.
Yeah.
Harold Willingham. And Harold Willingham, I also ran for governor and lost that. And then I ran for Court of Appeals in 1976. Now, I'm the only person that has ever been elected to all three positions with opposition. Now, there's only 2 or 3 other people, and I don't know who they were. One of them was Brown, And they all served, and all three of them, in the 1800s. Nobody's ever served since the 1800s, and all three of them in any capacity.
You were elected.
I was elected with opposition.
Right.
As I told him, I had such a poor politician, I couldn't get anybody to appoint me to anything. But I was elected, all three of them. And so when I served out as the Supreme Court, I was on that 11 years, Court of Appeals 4 years and 4 months. And I got out of that, and then I started to still stayed up there, came back to Cairo, came back to Mayra practicing law. And I've enjoyed it, practicing law up here. And I tried my best. I had two governors to tell me a tale, I put it nice. Two governors told me if I'd get the House and the Senate to pass a bill doing away with the cap on the age that judges could serve, they'd sign it. Both of them
didn't sign it.
Neither one of them signed it. Never would let me talk to him.
If you don't mind, let's go back to 1966 when you were elected lieutenant governor and Lester Maddox was elected governor. How did you and Governor Maddox get along?
We got along all right because he didn't fool with me and I didn't fool with him. But see, he called me a liar in public on 4 different times, and I never did a lie to Lester Maddox. You just could depend on. You couldn't tell him anything. I got where I would not go in his office without I had a witness. And because he'd deny what he said to you. You couldn't agree with him. He wouldn't make an agreement with you. And when he called, I got tired of being called a liar, so I just never would go in there.
So you didn't have a day-to-day relationship about issues that affected the state?
Issues? He didn't know what an issue was. No, we didn't have no issues. Never were discussed. And that's when I got to be Speaker of the House. Well, in fact, before I got to be Speaker of the House, that's when I got tagged with George T. and George L. George L. was Speaker of the House, and then under Vanderbilt. Mm-hmm. But he was Speaker of the House before that too, with Talmadge. Mm-hmm. And Twitty was Frank Twitty was floor leader. Talmadge and what's his name? Vanderbilt. And whenever he was Speaker of the House and I was in there on those committees and all, they got to calling me George and him Good George. And finally, he told me, he says, I'm tired of being called Bad George. And they call me George and him Bad George, that's where he put it. He said, you don't get another name. And so they said, well, we call you George L. and him George T. And that's how we got the name George L. George T. Mm-hmm. And we both get accused sometime what the other one said. We stuck to our guns, though. If it was about me, I said he did it. If it was about him, you say he did it. And you know what? We never did get anybody that followed up on it. That just shows you how interested folks are in politics, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Never did.
You know, in some states, they require the lieutenant governor to run on a ticket with the governor. Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, for party unity it is, but you just about have to, Bob, because if you couldn't have everybody running for lieutenant governor. You just have to have have a ticket with them.
Well, you've been Speaker and you've been Lieutenant Governor. Which did you enjoy the most?
Speaker.
Why is that?
Speaker had power. Speaker was the most powerful man in state government next to the governor. And if you had a weak governor, he's the most powerful. George L. ran the legislative part of it when I was Speaker. When I was Lieutenant Governor, he was Speaker. Because all the money bills started in the House, as you know. And by the fact that they all started in the House, he ignored the governor. He ran that House like he wanted to. And I joined with him. We do things. Well, he didn't care. Bob.
Speaking to the governor?
Yeah, God didn't care. The first day of the legislature, I was Speaker of the House the first term. The last day of the session, the conference committees were out trying to figure out the appropriation bill. And the governor had a pork barrel for somebody over in Columbus, Georgia, $200,000. He wanted appropriated for $200,000 so he could do a little politicking. Well, George L. and I discussed it. Excuse me. George L. wouldn't agree to it. And I said, oh, they don't want $200,000. He said, I ain't going to agree to it. He would not agree to it. At 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, everybody's sitting around waiting for the conference committee, and that's all they were stuck on. I told my board, I said, we promised the governor, we've got to stay with it. About 5 o'clock, I saw that George L. was heck bent, he wasn't going to move. So, and I wasn't going to move unless the governor released me, because I promised him I'd do it, and I was going to do it. I went down to his office. I told him, I said, I'd like to see Governor Maddox. He says, he ain't here. I said, not here? I said, doesn't he know this is the last day of the session? The Appropriation Committee is still out? Where is he? Oh, he sat down, he's down in Macon, Georgia, riding his bicycle backwards for the detaining school children down there. I walked back up, I didn't even knock, I opened the door. I said, you know that $200,000 y'all tied up on? I said, yes. I said, throw it out the door, pass that appropriation bill, and let's go home. They did it. He never mentioned it. Never mentioned it. He didn't know, he forgot about it.
So, in 1976, you ran for the Court of Appeals.
Yeah. Now there's a little deal made there. The Court of Appeals was Charlie Parnell. He was on the Court of Appeals. And he wanted to run, he was going to quit. He tried to get the then president governor to appoint Charlie Jr. as a state court judge, some little something up there. And the governor wouldn't do it.
That was Busby.
Right. He wouldn't do it. Well, Charlie and I were very close because we both worked in Carl's headquarters. We got to know each other real well. So he came to me, he said, I tried to get Busby to appoint my boy, and he won't do it. He said, just a little, I stayed in state court. And he said, you want to be Court of Appeals? I said, I dang sure do. He said, all right, stand ready. I ain't gonna tell him I'm not gonna run for the Court of Appeals until Wednesday before the deadline on Monday for doing it. So he called me, he says, I'm gonna do it this morning, this afternoon. And so the next morning I already had it arranged. I had my people lined up and all, and I announced for the Court of Appeals. And nobody that could beat me would run because several of them tried it, and Charlie helped me a little bit. He said, now, you remember he ran 2 years ago for governor. He said, he got an organization out there. I said, time you get yours put together, he'd be elected. because you can't do it. And that did keep anybody from, with a real threat from, because of that. So I was elected Court of Appeals. And I wasn't satisfied with Court of Appeals. I'd always wanted to be on Supreme Court. And I knew Busby wouldn't appoint me, but I wanted to clear to keep him from saying, well, if he'd asked me. So I went and asked him. His answer was a slick political answer. I smiled behind my hat. He said, I never make up those decisions. I find out the opening's there. I said, George, don't tell me that. I've been around here, and you know that better than that. And I announced for it. I say this, he didn't get involved in it.
Mm-hmm. We elect our judges. The people elect our judges. Some are appointed. Do you think that politics and judges races mix?
Oh yeah, don't let anybody kid you. You see, Charlie Parnell elected me because he just didn't resign until it's too late for anybody else to do anything. There was no money. Nobody tried to buy anybody, like a famous case going on now. But it was just politics, friends, good old boys.
Well, you served on the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Which one did you like the best?
I like Supreme Court better than any elected position I've ever had. Speaker of the House in for years.
Tell us about being a Supreme Court justice.
Well, there's a lot of responsibility there, really, because that's the last, and you need to take that seriously, because that's the last place that a man got a chance of getting help. So you ought to be real careful about that. I wrote a lot of dissents. I just thought that before any man had the final judgment passed on him, the evidence ought to be unassailed against him. And there was two things that I did when I got on the Court of Appeals before I ever got on the Supreme Court. When I got on the Court of Appeals, all the opinions was written like this. Taking the evidence, whenever they affirmed that if a man lost a case and they'd affirm it, that'd be civil or criminal, they'd always say, taking the evidence as being in favor of the words to this, in favor of the state as found by the lower court, we find thus knowing, then went on and approved the lower court. I didn't start my opinions that way. I didn't think it ought to be that way. I just started off from scratch. I thought, by God, that just because the lower court found the man guilty, that ought not to. Because if you don't run it that way, why you have appellate court? And I didn't run him that way. And I always, there's another thing I did that nobody else did. The first paragraph, I'd say what the case was about and all like that. And then when I finished that paragraph, I'd add a new paragraph of one sentence that I either affirm or deny the other court and then write my opinion. My reason for that, I thought that having been a trial lawyer and on the Court of Appeals for the first time, but the trial lawyer what taught me most. I thought I ought to let the judge know in the first paragraph, after I put out the facts, what I had done. So then, he could read the whole brief from the court below, knowing how I had held the case. Otherwise, if you didn't do that, you had to read the whole case, and before you could find at the end what it's all about. And that, you see some judges do it now, not many, but they quit both of those things. I tell you another thing that we changed in the Supreme Court. The first day I was on the Supreme Court, the first day, they assigned my cases. And there's a case dealing with the county commissioners. And I want to say it was from Augusta, but I'm not sure. And I caught it, and I wrote an opinion and reversed it. And the other guy, the other court, went 6-1 against me. Oh, and then I said, all right, now, Mr. Chief Justice, who are you going to assign this case to? He says, to you. I said, what do you mean to me? I said, I've just found it against him, and you all are for it. He said, it's the rule of this court. The man that has the case, if he writes an opinion, reversing it, and the rest of the court goes against him, then he has to write the opinion affirming it. I said, how do you write that upstream? I said, I can't write it. He said, well, that's a rule. I said, all right. We had a Rule 36 and a Rule 59. And the Rule 59 in the Supreme Court was, and I got that rule changed too. That's the way I was the one that got that rule in. If the evidence and the judge's charge, there was no error in that, we would affirm the trial court without an opinion. So I just took that case and I said, the trial court, blah, blah, and all like that, affirm this opinion by Rule 59, period. And then I wrote one of the doggonest dissents you've ever seen in your life. That's the last time that ever happened. They changed that rule immediately. It made no sense, Bob. How you gonna write a for and against it all in the same time? It made no sense.
Let me ask this question about evidence, DNA.
That had not come about when I was. It just coming into I never had to deal with an opinion with that. That shows you how it just wasn't there. Mm. And I haven't gone to the trouble to try to learn about it in private practice because I don't do that much criminal work.
Mm-hmm. Seems, Judge Smith, that modern juries seem to prefer a sentence of life without parole over the death penalty. Mm-hmm. Do you think that will do away with the death penalty?
No. Oh, they keep doing that? Oh, sooner or later they're going to quit.
Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court handles quite a few death penalty cases. Yes. Another question, modern jurisprudence. What effect has the internet had on appellate courts, where now you can file over the computer and without oral arguments? Is that a good idea?
Not for me. I like for a lawyer to stand up there and argue the case, and let me look at him and have an opportunity to ask him questions. Sometimes you change your mind, not often, but sometimes you do. I had a little trick. Sometimes lawyers, you didn't believe that they had read the case good or something like that. And I had a trick I'd put on them. I'd pick out some little obscure point in his case that nobody with good sense would ask about, and I'd ask him about it. And I did that for one thing. I wanted to make him shoot straight with me with the whole case. Because I know what was running through his brain. That stupid jerk knew about that little important thing, he has read this thing. It worked. Worked every time.
Well, you've decided many cases as an appellate court judge with the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. Are there any that stand out in your memory?
Oh yeah, several of them. The Williams case. Remember the Williams case?
The child. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I dissented in that case, and it was a lot of furor. I was called a lot of names. And I told him, I said, what you ought to understand it is, I'm not saying he's innocent or guilty. I'm just saying there was not evidence enough. The preponderance of the evidence is the point of him being, the evidence beyond reason, but I didn't point to him as being guilty. I just think the evidence didn't support the verdict.
That was the Atlanta child murder case.
That's right.
Decided basically on fiber evidence.
That's right. And the thing they called it child murders, the two people they tried him for both grown men. No children involved. Grown men. And I won't go into this, but I think I know how they got the fiber evidence. See, the fiber evidence never had been proven beyond a scientific verification, in this state at that time. And that certainly was no case to try to on whether or not it was a scientific verification from the fiber evidence.
Well, there was a feeling among some that that case was hustled to a conclusion, that they wanted to stop it, so they, the guy was convicted. I don't know whether that holds any water or not, but there was a feeling among some people at that time that fiber evidence was a weak.
Weak tool.
Right.
Yeah.
Any other cases you remember?
Well, I don't know why this sticks in my brain, but it does. When I was on the Supreme Court, the law in Georgia, the case law in Georgia, the law in Georgia, said that a married man could not rape his wife. And one of those came to our court, and I caught it. I did a lot of background work, and I wrote an opinion that said, not only can the man rape his wife, this one raped this one. See, they'd been separated, and so he came back, and then I went into some detail, the background of how that ever became law where a wife couldn't be raped by a husband. And it came from the old rule and old law and law like that women, when they married, they were chattels. They was treated as property by the husband. And the offspring from that was, if they were treated like a chattel, they were just like he owned a cow or a horse or something, and he took the position that he could do whatever he wanted to, from beating her on up or down, because he was just a chattel. She wasn't a person. She just was his property totally, and he could do it as he pleased. I got a lot of comment on that one. Most of it wasn't favorable, but I got comments from that on men that wouldn't dare touch their wives, and I knew it, but they didn't like the idea of the way it went through.
Well, you've certainly had an outstanding career. If you had all those years to go over again, is there anything you might have done differently?
Yeah. I'd run for governor in 1966.
I meant to ask you that question. Why didn't you decide to run for governor in 1966?
Well, my supporters had already agreed to that, and Mills Lane was my big supporter, and he had already given me a 100% assurance of supporting me as lieutenant governor. But whenever Vanderbilt, you remember Vanderbilt got out?
Mm-hmm. And Talmadge almost got in?
Yeah, almost. But what held me up, Mills Lane was on an extended European trip. I wasn't about to call him in Europe, ask him to switch his allegiance to me for governor without being able to talk to him. I knew him too well for that. And I was not going to switch from a sure support to a, didn't know whether I was going to get support or not. And I just told them flat out. I was called about it. I said, no. And I said, don't go tell it that I'm thinking about it, because I'm not. Because that's all you have to do is tell one person thinking about it. You got your running, and half a dozen other people announced for lieutenant governor, and you out in the woods. And I just wouldn't do it from that very reason.
Looking back, what do you think was your greatest accomplishment?
Holding all three of those positions. That's just about impossible to do. You talking about having to be in the right place at the right time. A lot of times. You had to be.
How about your biggest disappointment?
Not ever being Supreme Court Justice. I'm Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Time ran out.
That's right. I got old. I reached the 75 years old before I could make it.
How would you like to be remembered?
As an honest, hard-working, truthful politician.
Well, you're that.
I hope so.
And I want to thank you for Young Harris College and the Richard Russell Library at the University of Georgia, and myself for being our guest.
Thank you. Appreciate being asked. In 1966, when I was running for lieutenant governor, the last Saturday before the election, the following Tuesday, Bainbridge, Georgia, which is right next to Mitchell County, where I was born and raised, and right next to Grady County, where I practiced law, had a shindig, and they invited everybody down, all the candidates, to speak on Saturday. You know how to held them back in then. Don't do it. Television got rid of all that now. Yeah. So I knew what they was aiming at. Marvin was supporting Zach. Zach was born and raised at Colquitt, 24 miles up the road, and his wife was born and raised in Bainbridge. And it was plenty of nose on your face what they was going to do. So on Friday afternoon, I found out, I told about it, and they said, we're going to have one person to introduce all of you. Said, you and Zach Daniels are close, it'd be hard and fair and all that kind of stuff. And I told Eloise, I said, that's a crock. They're going to wind up selecting somebody to introduce them, which will be Marvin Griffith. And they're going to start at the bottom end of the alphabet for the first one to speak, not the top like the Rouge. I said, this is a setup now. Don't give me, it worked out just exactly like at 5 o'clock, Friday afternoon. Got a call. Well, they've changed the rules on you. I said, I'm supposed to speak first, right? They said, that's right. I said, that ain't no surprise to me. I've been knowing they're going to do that all the time. Got down there the next morning, and they had a big old long flatbed trailer everybody got on where we was going to speak. We got up there. Peter Zach's wife was sitting on the platform right behind him. They put Eloise at the other end of the trailer, the last person at the other end, in the second row. You couldn't even tell she's back there. She's small, anyway. You couldn't even tell she's back there. If she was a hiccup, she'd have fallen off. And we were up front. Maddox had his few little words to say and sat down. Only reason there were a few, you had a limit. Then the next one was me, 3 minutes. Well, I had racked my brain. What in the world am I going to say? What am I going to say? I don't want to make it sound, no use in jumping on them. I couldn't match either one of them oratorically speaking. I knew better, each one of them was better on the stuff than I was. So don't challenge that. You got to do something else. Next morning, Saturday morning, we were going to fly down. I was shaving. I came out of the bathroom. I said, Eloise, I made up my mind. She said, what you going to do? I said, I'm going to brag on Marvin Griffin for the whole 3 minutes and never mention that girl. They called me up there, got me up there. Zach and Peter Zach was sitting down there. Zach and Marvin sitting down there. And Marvin had a piece of paper in his hand. And I couldn't imagine that. I didn't think anything about it when I saw it, but looking back on it, that was unreal for him. He didn't use anything to introduce anybody, particularly in a situation like that. They put me up there, and the only time I mentioned Zach's name was when I recognized him. I spent 3 minutes. I tell you what, I did the greatest job of lathering a man that's ever been on the former governor. How great he was for our community, how he brought stuff. I'm just 24 miles away, you see. How much he would appreciate him being that close to Cairo, how much he'd done for us, and how much he'd done for that part of the country, and what a great governor he was. I got 6 interferences clapping. And I noticed he looked at Zach about halfway through that thing and held that paper like that. It turned out he had written his introduction of Zach down and had released it to the news media. Now that was an insult to me. Now he just figured he didn't have anything in his hands to worry about, so heck with it. But you could tell that he was bothered. Whenever I'd finished and just filled him so full of syrup till you never could get it out of him, he didn't have anything to say about me. But he did. He used it. He had to use it. He turned me every way but loose. He called me, what was his favorite expression for McGill?
Rastus. Ralph McGill.
Yeah. He said he referred to me all the way through his Rastus McGill's something of it. It wasn't very nice. And he just ate me up. He didn't get a single solitary interruption with applause. The whole time. I got 6. He didn't get a 1. And you could tell the crowd was getting a little restless because there was a local board badge on him and he was trying to take advantage of him. And you could see it was just coming out. Well, some people left before he finished. Then Zach got up there, and not only did Zach eat me up alive, he used 5 minutes to do it. By the time he got through, it wasn't about last except my folks. Not a single interruption did he get. Not a one. The only time in my life I ever outsmarted 2 smart politicians, but that just absolutely, I left them by them putting me first. Of course, Zach treated me the whole way through like I was an accident. So that's a good way to have somebody running against you. Thinks you're a damn fool. Because they don't ever expect anything out of you.
Well, you sure turned that election around in a hurry in that runoff.
Yeah, sure did.
You were Speaker of the House, Judge Smith, during the period when Junior Bond was denied his seat.
Yes.
You remember that?
Yeah, 1965. I remember where I was when I got the call. I was speaking to a FFA group down in Sylvester, Georgia. Got a telephone call from a secretary. Yvonne Redding was my secretary. That was the number one. Deanie, I don't know whether she's 2 or 3 or 4, anyway, she was in the office also. Got a call at Sylvester. And Yvonne said, I think you better come to Atlanta. I said, what's important for me? Can't the governor take care of it? She said, yes, but I think you need to be here to answer some questions too, because they're going to be talking to you. I said, well, what happened? She said, well, Julian Bond burned his registration card. And for the want of a better word, the segregationist group is really up in arms up here. Said they are preparing a complaint to not seat him. And see, this was before it started. And I said, who's leading it? And I was not surprised. What was the representative from Statesboro name?
Jones Lane.
Jones Lane. God. Jones Lane, that's right. And said, Denmark Group is coaching him on the legal part. I said, oh, God. Denmark Group was a smart legislator. He really was smart. He'd been speaker there, been the floor leader in the House, so he knew what he was doing. And here I was, speaker the first time. I'm thrown in the ring with him. So I went back up there, and she said that he had burned it, and then big hullabaloo, and he was against it and wanting to know what I was going to do. And I said, well, I'm going to preside over it if it comes around to that. So the Senate passed it. They not refused to seat him. Voted on the bill that was to refuse to seat him. So whenever they voted to not seat him, I treated it like a bill. I referred it to the Judiciary Committee. Now, for y'all to decide, you're going to be the jury. The Judiciary Committee is going to decide whether or not the evidence put up here for this House by the two parties in the argument and all like that, whether or not it's sufficient enough to sustain what they say. Now, see, whenever they ask for everybody to stand to take the oath, the challenge already been thrown out to Julian, and I hadn't been sworn in Lieutenant Governor. I hadn't even been sworn into the House. So they voted on me to be in the legislature and Julian Mont all at the same time. And Julian's seat was right behind mine. And they told him to have a seat because he'd been challenged. And I got a picture of me standing up, taking the oath, and Julian sitting down right behind me. And so they did that, and then they gave me the oath, and then I took over from there on out.
As Speaker.
As Speaker, and I tried the case, like a judge, just like a judge. And we had a fellow named Brown, Ben Brown. You remember Ben Brown?
Ben Brown, yeah.
He was my very close friend, and he kept me. I took him in my confidence. I said, Ben, I got to have some help. I said, I got to know what's fixing to take place, and to keep this thing on an even keel. So we talked at length, And we agreed. He agreed with me and some things he suggested. His first suggestion was, he says, do not have any uniformed policemen in sight. He said, the people is opposing what's taking place here and supporting Julian, said, you won't have any trouble out of them if there's no policeman around, because there won't be anybody they can jump on. They'll get notoriety nationwide, because they pick out a policeman to get in trouble. So if there's no policeman, nothing take place. I said, that makes sense to me. So I had a patrolman there, but I brought him in for daylight, put him in the bottom of the Capitol. Nobody knew that was there except the governor and me, and one or two other people hadn't known about it. And Brown knew about it. I said, all right, I've already got that solved. I'm gonna put him in the basement. He said, that'll save you more problems than you know. He said, now what you gonna do about the balcony? I said, well, you know, we've already opened up the balcony, and there's no, you don't have to, you're not seated in this particular place. Anybody can sit anywhere they want to. Everybody knows that. That's been announced. He said, well, let me make one other suggestion. I said, what's that? He said, don't have anybody at the door up there passing out passes. Don't make them have to sign in for a pass even. He said, if you'll do that, you'll take the sting and you'll just destroy their whole plan. I said, all right, that's done. I didn't tell him that I was going to have GBI men all through the place in regular clothes. I had about 6 or 7 of them, and 1 or 2 hanging around close. And so I told it, we just took all the doorkeepers off upstairs that allowed people to go in. Just opened the doors and nobody was there. So whenever that crowd got there, Brown told me, he says, they're on the way. I said, all right, we're ready for them. Everybody scattered. When they walked in there, they all came in a big van, like, drove up right in.
These are Bond supporters.
These Bond supporters, yeah. And they were out of town, most of them. And they come marching through there and right upstairs, and when they got to the door wide open, ain't nobody there. And they started milling around like a bunch of cattle trying to cross a fire line. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to do. So we had the hearing, and they came in, sat down, no policeman to attack, and we just went through that thing just like it was a Sunday school picnic. Got through it and put them in there, and then the crew went out. We were over a day trying that thing. I remember that there's some prominent lawyer downtown called me up later and told me that he wanted to congratulate me on how well I handled that thing. Well, anytime if nothing happens, it's handled well, you know. Whether it was handled well or not, I think if I hadn't had Brown, I might have done what I did, but I don't know. That guy he's never did get much any credit because he couldn't give it to him. He didn't want no credit. He said, "Don't tell folks what I told. The good Lord, they'd be hanging me." So they didn't, and they came back in the committee, and the committee voted. I remember it's 5 voted to seat him. Most of them in DeKalb County, and 5 of them, I'm sure it was 5 of them to seat him. So when he came back and they read it, I read that out, and I said, you know, just don't show back up and he told me he's going to appeal it. And Bond came to me after it was over with and said, Mr. Speaker, I want to tell you something. I don't think anybody could have been any fairer than you were. Says, I have no complaints about the way you handle that thing, and I have no animosity towards you at all. And he told me more times that down the line. And boy, that was a rough time. There's a lot of tension. It's just the wrong word away from a bribe. But we'd already set one thing up. Whenever Carl and I got together before the session started, and we decided that we were going to issue a statement to the press, not hold any press conference, nothing about it, that the balconies to the House and the Senate, we cleared it with Zach. He said, all right, that the balconies on the House and the Senate were open to all people. They did not have to get any permission. All people was open to them. Now that was the first one. That didn't make it look like we were being forced into it. Because if we'd have waited till we had the other thing, it looked like, and we had a lot of folks mad at us. Mm-hmm. Folks never did know it. But the first day of the legislature, one black man showed up. That's the only black person showed up the first day. And he came 5 days in a row, sat in 5 different places in the balcony. I don't know what happened over in the Senate, but he was testing to see whether or not we meant it. We meant it. It wasn't so, oh, by the way, I worked with Senator Leroy Johnson, and he was helping us. Leroy Johnson was a African American at the right place at the right time, because he had the right kind of temperament. He could work with white people, and he didn't mind it. He had that confidence, and this state owes a lot to him. Him and Ben Brown, I tell you that. Usually a man who's in a place of leadership, he gets credit for everything that's good, credit for everything that's bad. Without Ben Brown and Johnson, we couldn't have pulled that thing off. That's the wrong word. That thing wouldn't have gone off as smooth as it did, because we knew what was going to happen, and we knew how to. And by knowing what was going to happen, we could use preventive measures that it didn't make it look like that the folks that were supporting Bond made us do it. Because they never did get to raise the roofers so they could get a policeman there, because there was no policeman there. So they never could tell the world what bad people we were. Okay.